welcome to episode 15 of Ping, a Firewalls.com podcast, a bi-weekly look at cybersecurity, including interviews, news, expert tips, and the latest trends. I'm Kevin Baxter, and I'm joined by my Firewalls.com colleague, Andrew Harmon.
Hello.
Hey, Andrew. As we tackle a different featured topic each episode. New episodes are out every other Wednesday, so subscribe or follow on your favorite podcasting platform to get the latest first. Ratings and reviews are appreciated, and you can always drop us a line at podcasts@firewalls.com. As always, thanks for listening, and now it's time for our featured topic and to welcome our guest for this episode.
We've talked about the ever-evolving cyber threat landscape before here on Ping, and in our headline segment, we touched on many perils of the day, like ransomware, phishing, malicious apps, and more. But while individual stories are important, just as vital is getting a broader overview of cyber attack trends from the people who know them best. In this case, those people are the experts at SonicWall's Capture Labs, who recently released the 2020 SonicWall Cyber Threat Report.
And to discuss some of the report's highlights, we welcome back our first repeat guest in Ping history, Brooke Chelmo, Senior Product Marketing Manager with SonicWall. Brooke, thanks very much for joining us again.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
And so before we get into some of the specific trends to watch for, let's talk about the report itself and what goes into it. How is the cyber threat report put together, and why does SonicWall feel that putting the report together and releasing it to the public is so important?
Yeah, so it's made from a mixture of all the metadata that's basically brought to us by all the firewalls, email security appliances. We're a large security platform company. So we have a lot of data that comes back to us. So what we tend to do is every 6 months go through that data and then put together any kind of anomalous trends, anything that's kind of different or special, or following up on old stories. So we find that it's important because it, one, lets us know where things are going. I speak about security all the time. This report has showed me that speaking about cryptojacking and warning people about cryptojacking will be a waste of my time. There's also other things too in terms of how we develop products and how we make life easier for our customers and partners.
Getting into some of the highlights here, let's start with the bad news, what you guys call the criminal advances. One notable trend is a decrease in ransomware, which sounds good on the surface, but the bad news here is that the ransomware seems to shift from quantity to quality of attacks. So how is this change manifesting?
And that was basically in part of all the changes that we've seen since about 2016 to where we are today. 2016 was very much spray and pray, very high volumes, just shooting it everywhere. Grandmother's computers were getting hit. It was just nasty. Everyone was trying to get in on this. People not really found it to be that profitable when they're doing it on that scale, and they're just causing more damage than they're actually generating revenue.
Turns out grandma doesn't have that much money.
Well, and it's tough, and try to get someone like that to go buy Bitcoin. My grandmother could never do that. So that being said, it became more targeted, hitting a lot of networks. And also in 2017, 18, these guys figured out how to make these strains go sideways. And that's what WannaCry became so famous for, because now we found a way to make this go laterally and infect multiple networks, including, like, say, SamSam ransomware in the city of Atlanta, which is probably one of the most famous cases for a lateral transfer of ransomware. So we're seeing this point now where they're trying to go after networks that have multiple networks attached to them, and namely, state, local, provincial, federal governments, just because, one, they have less staff, they have older devices, they may have more critical vulnerabilities that are able to be exploited, and they do have a larger public footprint. It also doesn't take too long to figure out, who's doing what, because a lot of these employee rosters are public knowledge, namely a lot of who the managers are, including their public salaries. So it's easy to kind of find who to target and go after them that way.
Yeah, that makes sense. And the one thing that did sort of juxtapose with that targeted nature to the local governments, schools, places like that you just mentioned, is that there are still some types of ransomware attacks that are going more towards the individual level, but they're doing it in a little bit different way. There were a couple of things mentioned in the report that talked about some more personal ways that ransomware attacks are still happening.
Yeah, so the common victim, like the consumer, like myself, when I'm away from a network and I'm at home doing my home thing, There is still a concern, specifically with watering hole attacks online. But generally, when it comes to the massive ransomware campaigns and the big damage that we're going to see is going to still be with public networks, namely state, local, federal, provincial governments, as well as corporate networks.
In the report, it mentioned that there's a little bit more of a dialogue happening now where an attacker who deploys a ransomware attack is actually willing to talk somebody through the process, potentially have a dialogue, negotiate, etc. When did that start to evolve?
Well, I would say that's been around for a little while now. It's just become more commonplace where you could interact with your hacker. So these days, Discord is the most common place to do that because, one, Discord has a wonderful chat service, and they have a beautiful scripting engine behind it. So it makes it possible to, one, automate a few things. If you get paid, then you can generate a key, to decrypt that person's endpoint. It's anonymous and encrypted, so it's hard to track things down, to track these cyber criminals down. And even if you do take down their Discord server, we'll just build a new one. It's easy to do, easy to migrate these servers over there and then rebuild that scripting engine, which a lot of folks are using to ping for vulnerabilities and launch malware campaigns.
Well, speaking of talking to your friendly neighborhood hacker, you got a shout out in this section involving your chat with the Hildecraft ransomware group, which we covered in episode 8 here. Any updates you want to share about that?
Yeah, talking with them is that, they're always working, always developing. So I think last time I left you, they were focusing on developing a runner to make this operate within memory and also focusing on building a bootlocker so that it would, lock things up. They're having difficulties getting the bootlocker to decrypt. So the bootlocker is doing a good job of encrypting, but to decrypt, it's becoming kind of a pain. So they're going to have to outsource that component, which is going to cost roughly only about $1,000. But again, Hildecrypt, this cell, they really want to cut their teeth and they really want to grow from the experience. So they really want to do it themselves, but if they have to, they will outsource it. Now, they did steal a third ransomware strain, and originally when I spoke to Twig at the RSA Time, not the actual conference, he was considering selling this third strain, most likely to someone that he interfaces with on these hacking communities. But it's performing better than Hildecrypt was, so he may actually be leaning on using this one, which is now called MaraCrypt, and letting Hildecrypt either be sold or laid by the wayside.
Now, is that based on a popular television show or anything?
It is Mara is a character within the Hilda series.
Really?
So I won't get into too much there because it does order it's an internal name they have for something. So
okay,
all right.
Very interesting that you've continued that dialogue through. It's been 4 or 5 months now since you first.
Off and on, yeah. And it's not every day, but I check in once every couple of weeks.
Yeah. So we talked about the shift towards the more targeted nature of ransomware, but also in the report, we also see phishing is down as well. But again, looks like that more targeted nature is coming through. So are we seeing more of the spear phishing kind of attacks than we used to see?
We're seeing that as a drop because, again, becoming more targeted. And the thing is, even when it comes to Hildecrypt, a lot of what they're doing, they have to outsource a lot of things. They have to pay for lists, much like I would as a marketer trying to contact people about a new product or competitive upgrade or something. So there is cost involved and there is time involved. And so they have to be a little bit more selective on who they go after. And since they're targeting certain networks and certain types of networks, namely provincial governments, which are mostly Microsoft shops, it makes it easier for them just to do that.
And what do you say would be the biggest driver behind the shift? Is it just plain more economical, or is it a bandwidth thing? Is there some sort of new technology that's making targeting a little more efficient?
Yeah, email security has really come a long way. 2014, 2015, we're talking about DKIM, DMARC, and all these other ways to stop spoofing, which have done a good job. But it's, of course, spam filters have been around since Aristotle was drinking hemlock, but so it seems. But it's gotten a lot better at diagnosing things. There's been a lot of sandboxing put in email security, which is stopping a lot of things. So, which is why now we're seeing, hackers being more targeted, trying to work better at crafting better emails instead of just that typical broken English you would see in a just spray and pray type campaign. And then, of course, now they're also, Hildecrypt is a good example of a firm or a group or cell that is they're trying to infect file types and target vulnerabilities that are not on the typical kind of list of things that you target, like PDF or Word.
Mm-hmm. What kind of vulnerabilities are you seeing that are emerging into the discussion now then, besides those traditional ones?
Yeah, and again, it comes down to patching, but the big one is, for example, if you're going to target a network, admin, someone who's working on the network or someone who would have potential access to people's endpoint controls and access into those endpoints, then they're going to try to target them and maybe use something that they use. So in the case of Hildecrypt, they're using VBox and infecting VBox files to try to get in that way. And therefore get access to the admin's endpoint or his or her tools that they're using online, and then from there infect the network at night.
Now, the report also mentions that malware is getting smarter, using encryption increasingly to get through network defenses. So why is this new encrypted malware technique growing in popularity and effectiveness?
Yeah, I'd say it's really grown the last couple of years, and then the year-over-year increase is definitely up there. It's not super easy to generate your own key and then have the malware take the encrypted key and then install it in your browser. So what they tend to do is, that's still happening. Then Google would like you to think that everyone is doing this, but in reality, it's not. A lot of them are using publicly issued certificates from, say, Let's Encrypt, or then you can encrypt your CNC server, you can encrypt your spoofing site, so that one, malware payloads are being encrypted, and two, it looks like to the user that they're on an official site. So the big part with encryption and using publicly available encryption is you don't have to propagate the root to the endpoint. You can just use the root that's already in that endpoint, and you won't have any broken encryption, and therefore the firewall won't be able to inspect the file that's going to the endpoint, which is why at that point, either you have to use the deep packet inspection of SSL on the firewall, or you have to trust your endpoint security solution that it has the capability and smarts or intelligence to sniff up that activity on the endpoint.
So you kind of answered my next question generally as far as what people should be looking to do to plug that encrypted traffic vulnerability. But are there any particular products that do a particularly good job at detecting the potentially encrypted malware?
Yeah, using man-in-the-middle technology, like it's not like what we call deep packet inspection of SSL, DPI, SSL. If you're using another firewall vendor, they're going to have a different term for that. But generally, when it comes down to, you can do that. But again, we're talking about things breaking. You have to whitelist things like Skype, and there are some things that will break that take some time and attention. You will need a bigger firewall. There's no such thing as a free meal here. Now, the other side of it is the endpoint security solution, which is why everyone's going towards advanced endpoint protection, also called AEP, or when it comes down to a list of other tools that people are using to protect those endpoints. But AEP is your first bet.
So we always like to talk about IoT on Ping. We bring it up just about every episode. What does the report say about attacks on things like smart TVs, thermostats, printers, things like that?
Yeah, well, again, IoT attacks always spike in Q3. And I believe it to be largely, and I don't have a direct source on this, but this just comes from looking at this over the last 5 years, always spikes in Q3. And I have to assume that it's because everyone's bringing home all these brand new smart devices into the home and the network after Black Friday. So again, a lot of these devices will ship with older operating systems that need to be updated. There are vulnerabilities in some of these things, or vulnerabilities in your router that allows you to access that IoT device. But ultimately, DDoS cannons are not going away anytime soon, and people would love to infect those and then steer traffic occasionally towards resources when they have that DDoS cannon rented out to somebody.
Mm-hmm. What I thought was interesting in the report overall was that the volume in IoT attacks wasn't that much higher last year over the year before, but still projecting forward, it almost seems like just because we know there is going to continue to be such a big growth in the usage of IoT devices that it's continuing to be a big vulnerability.
Yeah, exactly. So when it comes to corporate networks too, is, of course there's the DDoS cannon story, but the other part of it too is sometimes you can gain access to the network via the HVAC system, which is kind of the running joke here. But you do have that capability as well, just because people give so many permissions and so many things, and they don't exclude what it can't do.
Last one on the bad news side before we get into some hopeful pieces here. So the report says web application attacks doubled last year. Actually, I think 52%.
52%. Yep.
So why did these attacks spike so strongly, especially it looked like quite a bit in the second half of the year?
I think it's because, we're at this point where a lot of these cloud-based applications, Box, Dropbox, Salesforce.com, O365, the big push to move to the cloud is really made the attack surface so much larger and so much more ubiquitous. So just like how you'd be able to attack, send someone an infected Word file, you can almost count on anybody at the sales in their title to have, Salesforce access or some other CRM access. So we see a lot of these applications being attacked because there's a lot of, one, there's data that can be harvested and sold. Two, can be used to gain intelligence, say buying puts or calls on things. Three, we're also seeing people uploading infected files that people can download into the network.
And you would think because so many people are using so many of these cloud services that, some of these breaches are definitely on the bang for your buck scale, probably a little better than some of the other attacks.
Yeah, and it's protected differently than, say, a service that's within a data center. You're not going through this, firewall that's going to exclude you based on number of things. If you're able to get the password for some folks and they don't have, say, two-factor or multi-factor authentication turned on for the account, it may actually be much easier to access that account. But again, every situation is different. People are trying. And again, these are attacks that we're counting as blocked, which is good news in some ways.
Well, let's go ahead and move on to the good news, what the report calls security advances. It looks like there is quite a lot of improvements out there over the last year. How well is SonicWall itself doing at catching exploits like never-seen threats?
Yeah, that's the fun thing, too. And again, I'm going to preference this part of the podcast to say I'm not against VirusTotal, and I'm not going to put this down. VirusTotal is a great tool that we all look to. It's fun for threat research, but if you find something brand new, then go run to VirusTotal to see if it's been reported as a bad thing. I don't trust it for at least a couple of days. So we're finding that SonicWall real-time deep memory inspection and our Capture-ATP engine is able to identify and stop never-before-seen malware roughly 1.9 days before VirusTotal.
So could you tell us a little bit more about the deep memory inspection?
The fun thing about real-time deep memory inspection is that we want to see what malware wants to do, or I should say any code wants to do within memory. What we do here is that we allow it to go into the memory of the system, and then for that roughly 100 nanosecond window, we are seeing it open itself up where we can take a look at the payload. And so in that moment, we can freeze that code in time and then take a look at any artifacts that we can withdraw from that, and do a mixture of static and dynamic analysis on those widgets. And then from there, come up with a very quick determination whether or not this is malicious or not. Now, since a lot of sandboxing techniques out there wouldn't be able to stop anything or a lot of things without going to memory, this gives us kind of that essential advantage over a lot of technologies today.
And just jumping back before we leave the never before seen threats part of the conversation, does this encompass 0-day threats, or is that sort of additional to that term that we hear all the time, 0 days?
Yeah, so the term 0-day is kind of lulled about a little bit way too much. And it almost becomes almost a fear-mongering term where a lot of people, when they hear it, they roll their eyes. It means this is a brand new vulnerability and malware targeting that brand new vulnerability with very little time to adjust for it. So the actual term 0-day gets overused. So we tend to use the term never before seen malware because this would include 0-day, true 0 days, which again, very subjective on its term. And then second, this would also include updates to lots of things. So a lot of folks would like to overuse that term. So never before seen malware we find to be all-encompassing and doesn't offend anybody.
Fair enough. So moving on to some more security advances, the report talks about perimeterless security. So how would you describe what perimeterless security is and how it compares to the more traditional security boundaries?
Yeah, so perimeter security, traditionally we're talking about your firewall and your email security and everything that comes up against that perimeter and all these people behind that perimeter being protected by all these different defenses, from IPS and antivirus, et cetera, et cetera. Now, perimeter-less security tends to be more focusing on people who are outside of that, people who are traveling. 70% of people work from home or away from the office once a week. 53% of us, work away from the office 3 or more days a week. With coronavirus, maybe all of us are working 7 days a week from home. So with that being said, we're moving to this more model where we're able to deliver security through the cloud and then have a lot of things go through that portal where things are inspected there and security is managed in a cloud-based portal that one would authenticate into what we call a zero trust model.
It's really taking a more holistic approach to make sure that you're encompassing all of your workers instead of just the people within your 4 walls at your office.
Yeah. And traditionally, it's the stage 1 is, network security. Stage 2, of course, maybe alongside is, endpoint security with all of its advancements over the years. Third would be now CASBs have really come up where cloud access security, we call it CAS here at SonicWall, is protecting those cloud-based applications. And now with a SASE solution, which means, Secure Access Service Edge, is putting a lot of those services and everything into the cloud.
So whether it be a security advance or a criminal advance, we know the report was completed, but this landscape is always evolving. So has there something else that you wanted to touch on that you've noticed already since the report has been released that's an emerging trend now?
Well, nothing really per se. I mean, at the end of the day, it all comes down to proper disciplines. And it doesn't matter if it's a ransomware script or if it's a info stealer type malware or something. It really doesn't really affect you too much. But right now we are seeing people trying to, write emails and scam using coronavirus and trying to do different things. So I think right now, if anything, there's been a shift to more consumer-based attacks where you're trying to, for instance, hand sanitizer and like masks, like the special masks that can filter out bacteria and virus. Mm-hmm. These things are now being marketed as being sold for really good rates online, and trying to get people to submit payment now and get it later. And then obviously nothing arrives.
Right. It definitely looks like that opportunistic trend is happening. We've seen stories about coronavirus malware, and really it seems like even more than usual, it does seem like there's a shift in taking advantage of topics that might be able to draw people's attention without them giving it that extra bit of thought that they should.
Yeah. And that's where you tend to find watering hole attacks online. For even when like Katy Perry was at the top of her game, in the music scene, there was malware and sites dedicated to just phishing people and getting people to download things that they shouldn't be downloading. So, in fact, I made once a funny cartoon on the ransomware where this character named Jeff downloads Justin Bieber tunes. In reality, he downloads ransomware and infects the whole network, and hilarity ensues. But, anytime there's a topical thing like coronavirus or something that everyone's focusing on, there's always these little trends that pop up that always try to, victimize people based on that, which is why Black Friday deals with Apple products are always the best bet. Anytime the cheapest iPad that's out there, the cheapest iPhone that's out there, it's always $10 cheaper than everyone else. And that's usually the scam site, where they, need to download something, or there's an advertisement on the side that's, going to download a script to your endpoint. You see those type of things, or that, just take payment or just harvest payment credentials.
If it's too good to be true, it probably is too good to be true.
Yeah. I learned back in the day, like when you're walking downtown, in Bali, whoever has the lowest exchange rate's the one who's going to try to, swipe a few bills off the table and they hand you your stack of 20,000, notes.
Well, this report ends with a pretty strong preparing for what's next message. So let's end our discussion here with a very similar broad question for you. What do you see is next in the next 5-10 years coming at us?
Oh, 10 years. I'm really afraid of quantum computing coming online. Yeah, that's the big one. And in terms of quantum encryption and trying to defeat quantum encryption, we've already seen some scams come out of this. Not going to name a firm that came and went because they're suing anybody who speaks critically of them. But and it's not worth it. But they supposedly hacked and broke the RSA algorithm, and in reality, they're hacking some very low-level, easily hackable algorithms like MD5. But we see some scams coming out there in terms of on the investment side. But quantum computing and that being available as a service, really scares me that we're in this age. Obviously, deep fake technology is going to turn our descendants into just the world's greatest skeptics in terms of believing things that they see and trust. I sat down with my wife and kids, and I showed them the Steve Buscemi, Jennifer Lawrence deep fake, and just freaked everyone out.
Wow.
And that's where we're at in terms of that stuff. But overall, the next year, it's a lot of the same thing, becoming more targeted, more tools being available to people. Hackers will outsource more and more and work together to build ransomware scripts or malware scripts, and just try to find new ways. And keep your eyes open for any big critical vulnerability in any major system or major application that will bring the news agencies knocking on your door.
All right. Well, thanks for joining us again, I should say, here on Ping.
Thank you very much.
And now it's time for headlines. In this regular segment, we discuss a few top news stories in the network security world and what they may mean to you. Now let's jump into headline number 1. DoppelPaymer ransomware used to steal data from supplier to SpaceX and Tesla, and a few more than that too. So the subject of this cyber attack is probably not a company you've heard of, but Visser Precision, which is the subject, builds custom parts for a few aerospace and automotive companies you probably have. The aforementioned SpaceX/Tesla, Lockheed Martin, Boeing, Honeywell, and more. They may even be referred to as household names, Andrew.
Yeah, and this story really points out an issue with cybersecurity that we talk about specifically in the IoT world a lot is sort of attacks lower down in the supply chain that will bubble up and further complicate things a little higher up. So obviously you would expect companies like Lockheed Martin and Boeing to have very good cybersecurity. They've got the money and the talent for that, but attackers have wisened up, and rather than going for those big, robust, fortress targets, they're going for the smaller guys a little lower at the ladder.
Yep, who may have access to some of that important data. So the attack in this case involved the theft of company data, and Visser confirmed it was targeted by a, quote, cyber incident, which is a nice vague way of acknowledging that something happened. But a threat analyst discovered the attack when he came across a series of non-disclosure agreements with Visser's aforementioned clients. I've used aforementioned twice in 2 minutes.
It's a good word.
I don't know if I get a medal for that. He found them on a hacker website.
Yeah, and so this causes a few issues for not just Visser, but for all the larger companies involved, too, because a lot of these companies have large federal contracts. And so, if you start having non-disclosure data out there for the public to see and, you get that sensitive data suddenly out before everybody's eyes, that can really have an impact on things like contract pricing terms, agreements in the future that maybe that company, the victim company, Visser, will no longer be able to compete for.
Right, and that brings us to the type of attack that this was, which is a little different than your traditional ransomware. DoppelPaymer is a type of ransomware. It's a little bit more evolved. So it does the traditional ransomware thing where it gets in and encrypts files so it can ask you to pay a ransom to unlock them. But it also exfiltrates or takes out company data and uses it as additional collateral with the threat of potentially releasing that data, so sort of a double ransomware.
And this has been seen a lot with DoppelPaymer and even some other similar attacks. For example, Emotet and TrickBot teamed up for similar attacks where not only are they ransoming your files and asking for a payment to unlock them, but they've already got your data and they're either going to sell it or threaten, to expose it and sort of add a little more to that incentive to go ahead and pay the ransom.
Yeah, so it means that if your defense against ransomware is simply backing up that data somewhere else, that's not enough in this case.
Yeah, this certainly changes the risk calculation for a lot of companies. They have to not only decide if it's, worth it to try to restore it on their own, but also, if this stuff does get published online, what are they losing then?
Yeah, and you mentioned the implications for a non-disclosure agreement. The confidential data. You might lose the trust of all these big vendors, which then deal with the government, which then takes you out of that whole pipeline. But also, in a more direct sense, it's pointed out in this piece that there are fines involved with the release of certain types of sensitive data that would be potentially included here.
Right. So this new type of ransomware, malware team up here, it's more of an intrusion here, is really about changing the calculations and, giving these companies several things to worry about rather than just a simple, is this more or less expensive than doing it ourselves?
Yeah, and it kind of brought to mind something that Brooke mentioned, or at least that was covered in the cyber threat report, which was more on a personal level, but a lot of ransomware on the personal side is getting into the threat of releasing some sort of personal information publicly to get somebody to pay.
The corporate side of that coin.
Yeah, this is scaled up on a major level, but similar in terms of what it's doing. And it's an example of every time you think that you're getting a little bit ahead on the cybersecurity side of things,
there's another step out there.
There's a twist.
Well, we should expect ransomware to keep getting more targeted and more human-focused here in the next coming years.
So what do you think Elon Musk thinks of this story? Probably not too happy about it.
Not too happy, no. I mean, obviously not his fault, but it's going to impact him in one way or the other. So that's the frustrating aspect here.
Maybe he'll write a song about it.
Could be.
On to headline number 2. Microsoft confirms takedown of most prolific hacker network. Millions of users affected. So Microsoft just announced that they've taken down the Necurs botnet. And so pretty major botnet situation. What did we see about how major?
Oh boy, this story has a lot of big numbers. A round of applause for Microsoft, first and foremost, on getting this done. But yes, the botnet in question, Necurs, has infected as many as 9 million computers worldwide. They use these computers, known as zombies, after infection, to distribute spam emails, malware, DDoS attacks, things like that. So around the world, basically every country on the map is probably represented in this botnet, and Microsoft took down probably 90% of the world's email distributed malware issue just overnight, it seems. No, they've been working on this for, I believe it was 8 years of detective work on Microsoft's part.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and you're not exaggerating on the 90%. This is actually a number that Microsoft put out, that the botnet had created somewhere in the neighborhood of 90% of the world's email distributed malware over the past 3 years, from 16 to 19. So
we are all safe, everybody.
Yeah, I guess that means
let's go home.
Celebration in order. Let's stop everything and play some music. It's pretty great. Okay, probably not done with email malware. It probably finds its way somewhere else.
Yeah, there's a vacuum for someone else to come in. So this effort was spearheaded by Microsoft's digital crime unit called BitSight. It also included 35 other nations' partners to help us out here.
So backing up a little bit, for those who are unfamiliar with the terminology, you talked about zombie computers. According to our very own Firewalls.com threat dictionary, a botnet consists of a large collection of infected systems that can be remotely operated by a single threat actor in order to execute large-scale malicious attacks. So botnets can be used to send things like what you said, spam email, DDoS attacks, other things like that. So the botnets then create the zombies. And what I wanted to cover also from our threat dictionary is how to figure out if your computer may be one of those zombies. So a computer or device that is part of a botnet will run especially slow while the user is active, and will also continue activity when the user is not present. And you might become a zombie computer if you download a certain type of malware. So it's a nice circle
Something
there, right?
To check into, yeah. So owners of zombie machines usually are completely unaware that they've been compromised at all, and they've got no idea that while they sleep, their computer's up to no good. Mm-hmm. Many might find that their devices have been helping with cybercrime for years without their knowledge. So definitely take a second to check in and dig around and see if your own machine has been zombified.
Mm-hmm. Back to that spam email stat. So we talked about the 90% number, which is a pretty big number.
Right.
They actually picked out one particular computer that was infected that BitSight monitored for about 58 days. And over those 58 days, it sent 3.8 million spam emails to 40.6 million potential victims. So not only multiply that one computer by 9 million for the 9 million zombie computers.
I don't have my calculator handy, but a lot of zeros at the end of that number.
Yeah, and that's just over 60 days. So then add in the length of time that that Necurs has been operating, which is, 8 years? They said they've been working on this and probably had been out there a little bit longer.
Numbers, yeah. They also mentioned that they saw attacks in just about every single country in the world during this period. So definitely, they're not discriminating based on where you're from.
Yeah.
They believe that Necurs has been operated by a Russian group, though that they note this group has also rented out the system plenty of times for other attackers if the price is right. So it could be them behind it or just whoever paid them to use the system.
Mm-hmm. Back as of 2017, at least, IBM noted that Necurs was primarily known for delivering banking Trojans and ransomware threats, but over the course of time, it continues to evolve and reinvent itself. So that doesn't mean that might be the last version of malware that you got from it.
Yeah, they've got something in their back pocket, I'm sure. So talk a little bit about how Microsoft did this. On March 10th, they got a court order from the United States District Court for Eastern District of New York. That's a mouthful to say. Basically allowing Microsoft to seize the infected system of Necurs US-based infrastructure. So basically, they took control of all the machines that were infected. And they also went ahead and predicted 25 months in advance all the possible domains that the Necurs bots could have created, and basically got those starved out before they could get a chance to set them up. So they took over most of the U.S. infrastructure for Necurs, blocked it from creating anything else, and basically let it slowly starve itself out.
So it's kind of a case of the good guys winning a little bit here, or at least jumping ahead in this particular case. And I think it's nice to see, and we've talked about this from time to time, where we do actually see these companies making efforts, proactive efforts to try and stop some of these threats that are affecting many of their customers. So good to see that this unit exists and that it's, making some progress.
Yep. And from now on, we'll only deal with 10% of the email spam.
Yep.
Supposedly.
That inbox is going to be pretty empty. Now for headline number 3. So this is a two-pronged headlines segment following a similar theme. The two stories are titled Gender Equality in Cybersecurity Could Drive Economic Boost, and Cybersecurity's Diversity Problem Puts Us All at Risk. We've mentioned offhandedly a few times that the cybersecurity industry as a whole is facing a shortage of qualified workers. And these two pieces may highlight a couple of reasons why.
Right. So starting on the gender equality article here, you mentioned that there's been struggles over the years in the cybersecurity workforce basically to fill roles. And this article notes that the workforce must grow by at least 145% to meet the current demand in the coming years for cybersecurity. So, lots of companies are out there looking for qualified talent, and perhaps increasing their diversity and diversity hiring will be a solution for that.
Yeah, so without that growth, the ISC Squared report suggests that 4 million jobs will be unfilled over the coming years. And so this study referenced here by Tessian researchers found that if the number of women in cybersecurity equaled the number of men, it would boost the U.S. economy by $30.4 billion and the UK economy by 12.6 billion pounds. So that's quite a growth. Yes. Quite a bit of growth there.
So I guess the question is, what exactly are the issues that are preventing the gender gap from narrowing and getting more women in the cybersecurity industry?
So this study also surveyed and interviewed a number of female cybersecurity professionals in the U.S. and UK. And a couple of suggestions. They suggested closing the wage gap between men and women would help. Women in the field are paid on average 15 to 20% less than men. Those polled also suggest a lack of clear career paths and a lack of role models, to name a couple of other reasons why more women don't pursue cybersecurity careers. So those are those are all pretty legitimate things that hopefully could be addressed.
Yeah, one thing of interest I notice is that women in organizations with 500 or more employees, so these large, more enterprise-type organizations, are nearly 3 times as likely to cite the gender gap as a career challenge that they've faced. So generally speaking, the trend is the larger the company, the larger the gender gap appears.
Yeah, and this story, the study also talks about a skills gap, which I think all sort of circulates back into each other there. So if there is a lack of interest potentially among young women to pursue a career such as this, then obviously there would be a skills gap related to a gender gap there. I think the overarching point is definitely well taken, that it's better to diversify the workforce to give yourself a better option of, actually having enough people to work in it.
Right, yeah, it sounds like there's definitely talent out there. It's just untapped at this junction. So.
Yeah, there needs to be a little bit more of an incentive for the non-traditional, I guess, or non-stereotypical IT professional to come up. And
that takes us to our second story there about diversity being an issue for cybersecurity. So this is about an article written by Chief Security Officer for Augusto, which is a business payroll services company named Frederick Flee Lee. Flee, I will note, is spelled Flee, not Flea. So this is not a parasite thing. He's more like, if you see me, you better get out of here kind of nickname. He points out that the current makeup of demographics in the IT industry basically results in corporate networks that are being protected by a group of people who look the same, think the same, and were educated in the same way.
And he mentions that as a weakness, in that these people who are looking the same and thinking the same in particular, they might not be thinking about every potentiality, especially social engineering attacks that are targeting specific demographics of folks. They, might not understand what that targeting would be doing.
Right. So because attacks and attackers these days are becoming much more focused on sort of the human element of security, and you're seeing a lot more phishing and social engineering type attacks, the industry really needs to understand the cultural factors that influence the human element, instead of just saying, every human's going to act this way when they see this kind of email, and here's how we stop it.
Yeah, and it harkens back a little bit to stuff that we see in the entertainment industry as well, where there's been a push in recent years to get more voices that had not previously been involved in writing TV shows, writing movies, directing movies, acting in specific roles, to get a seat at the table more or less, because having those voices from different perspectives can really inform the content. And it's really exactly the same scenario here that he's suggesting in terms of the content of these social engineering attacks that are taking place. That it's just a blind spot. It's not an intentional blind spot necessarily among the IT professionals who are in these management positions, but it's something that exists.
Right, and Lee points out that this is probably not exactly a conscious decision business is making so much as the result of the culture and how they hire. So, for example, he points out that there's sort of an acceptable path in the IT industry where you go through, you get your education from a certain institution and you get a certain degree, and you go intern and follow a certain career path that leads you here. Whereas Lee's arguing that maybe we should sort of expand that and rethink what we think is the classic career path to the cybersecurity roles.
Yeah, he pointed out as a young African-American growing up in the South, he came across an article about a black hacker named John Lee, a.k.a. John Threat, and it really kind of made an impact on him as seeing somebody who looked like him as a sort of role model in the industry. Obviously, he was an actual hacker who maybe did a few things not so great, but it was something that piqued his interest, piqued Frederick's interest in this field, led him into cybersecurity, and he's had quite a career in cybersecurity. So one of the things that he points out is having that role model around for young people to follow.
That reflects just what was said in the gender gap article here. Just representation is important, and if we keep pushing that in the cybersecurity industry, then that will certainly help increase diversity all around.
Yep, and he also encourages the industry to just build a more inclusive and welcoming culture to knock out some of that, very traditional path that he's argued that people have been taking into IT management roles, because one of the things that he talks about is not just a lack of diversity in the entire field. He also talks about a lack of diversity in management positions specifically.
Yeah. And he also points out he calls out a mindset that a lot of security guys have where they always want to be the smartest or coolest guy in the room with the sunglasses and hoodie that we're all classically familiar with. And, he's just asking maybe if we were all a little more open and friendly and, tried to dissuade any sort of who's the coolest, smartest guy contests and instead just work together, then, we're going to learn and grow together as well.
So you're saying I should take off my sunglasses and maybe dress differently?
Take your sunglasses off.
All right. I do wear my sunglasses at night. And thanks for joining us for this episode of Ping, a Firewalls.com podcast. Thanks again to Sonic Wall's Brooke Chelmo for joining us to talk about the 2020 Cyber Threat Report. Check out the links in the description to learn more, as well as our blog, firewalls.com/you guessed it, blog. Subscribe or follow now to ensure you get the latest episodes as soon as they're available. And please do rate and review us wherever you listen to the podcast. Visit firewalls.com for all your network security needs and give us a follow on Facebook, Twitter, and LinkedIn. For Andrew Harmon, I'm Kevin Baxter. We'll be back soon with another episode. But in the meantime, we remind you to get secure, stay secure.